Good morning. Please raise your hands if you cannot hear me. Uh-oh, I'm afraid they can't hear. Oh, how many hours, what time do I have for the speech? 2 hours. 2 hours. Free software is a technical thing, but the issue of free software is not a technical issue. It's an ethical, political, and social issue. It's the issue of what the rules of society should be for using software. Most of the time, when people consider this question, they work for software companies, so they consider it from a self-serving direction. They ask themselves, what rules can we impose on everyone else to make them pay us a lot of money? I'm sure you've heard the answers that they get. I had the good fortune in the 70s to be part of a community of programmers who cooperated and shared software. And because of that, I was able to look at this basic question from a different direction, to ask, what rules make for a society that's good to live in? And I came up with completely different answers, which are the subject of this talk. But let me say a little about this community. It consisted of programmers at some of the best universities. Sometimes programmers at computer companies participated also. In this community, if you wrote a program, you would share it. It was normal, and other people could share it too. The lab where I worked, the Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT, was in a way the deepest part of this community, because there all the software we used was the community's software. It was all free software. So this was possible because the staff hackers at the lab had developed our own time-sharing system, the Incompatible Time-Sharing System, or ITS for short, and my job was improving this system. Because we had our own time-sharing system, we didn't have to use any non-free software. We were able to live a life of freedom to cooperate. So in this community, if you walk past another hacker's screen, and because hacker is what we called each other, we the programmers in this community, if you came past another hacker's screen and saw something unusual, you'd say, hey, what is that? And he would say, that's the new foobar program that we just got from Stanford, and it's in the foobar directory. So you would look in that directory and see, of course, the executable that you could run, but also the source code that you could read and study to see how they solved those problems. In running the program, you'd probably come across bugs, and you might have ideas for new features. You could go to the source code and fix the bugs and add the new features. You could make all sorts of changes. You could even cut a piece of the source code out and put it into another program that you were writing, perhaps for a different overall job. So you could use the program not only by running it, but in all the various ways it could be useful. The software we developed was part of human knowledge. Our work was a project to contribute to human knowledge, and our work was available to everyone. And I felt very good about my work because of the fact that it was meant for everyone. It was not just to help one group of people defeat some other group of people, or beat them out for some prize, which I would not feel very proud of. But then we all got a taste of what life was like for the other computer users, the ones who were not part of a community like ours. This happened when Xerox gave MIT a laser printer. Now, you may have heard this story. This is actually one of the many things that called my attention to the ethical issues of free software. It's not as if this all by itself taught me right from wrong, but it did make me think. This laser printer was in some ways a very good printer. It printed a page per second. It had very high resolution, and straight lines were nice and straight, much better than our old printer. But in one way it was not better, because it got frequent paper jams. And this printer was in a place that not many people wouldn't see it very often. They would only go there when they were looking for output. So it would stay jammed for a long time. When we recognized this, we of course thought about trying to solve it the way we solved the problem for the old printer, which also got paper jams. And unlike the new printer, the old printer was very slow. So we were not printer engineers, we were programmers. We couldn't make the printer any better, but we were able to write features in the software to compensate for the problems of the printer. For instance, there was a feature that every time the old printer finished printing a file, the system displayed a message on the user's screen saying, "Your file foo has been printed." So you had to wait because the printer was slow, but you didn't have to wait extra just because of having to guess when it was time to go to the printer. You knew when it was time to go to the printer. And because of the paper jams, I added a feature that every time the printer got jammed, the system displayed a message on the screen for each user waiting for printing, saying, "The printer is in trouble, go fix it." If you got that message, you would not dare assume someone else would fix it, because you knew only a few people would get this message. So you would go to the printer immediately. So the printer still got jammed, but a minute later, 2 or 3 people would come and fix it. And as a result, we kept the old printer running. The jams happened, but they didn't keep it down for very much time. That was good, so of course we thought about using the same solution for the new printer. But there we ran into a stone wall. We couldn't even try. You see, we were able to add this feature for the old printer because the old printer was controlled by a free program, part of the community's software. So we had the source code, and we were therefore able to make changes limited only by our own skill. But the new printer was controlled by a proprietary Xerox program, and we didn't even have the source code. So we were unable to make any changes at all. We were prisoners of our software. The result was constant frustration. You'd type the command to print a file and go back to work, and you wouldn't think of going to the printer soon because you know it's not worth it. So after a while you notice, oh, it's been half an hour. It's not worth going to the printer yet. I'll keep working. So you go back to work, and a while later you notice it's been a whole hour. Maybe it's printed now. So you walk upstairs to the printer and you see it's been jammed the whole time. So you fix the jam and go back to work, and a while later you notice a time. Oh, it's been half an hour. Maybe it's printed now. So you walk upstairs to the printer and you see it had printed 200 pages of other people's stuff, which was 3.5 minutes of printing for this fast printer, and then jammed again. And at that point you'd say, I'm going to stand here and fix this damn thing every time it jams until my output comes out. And you'd actually wait at the printer, which is, of course, what you were hoping to avoid doing by not going up sooner. Constant frustration, and what made it even worse was to realize that we could have solved the problem, but Xerox was deliberately standing in our way, deliberately keeping us helpless. Then I heard that somebody at Carnegie Mellon University had a copy of that source code. Eventually I was visiting there, so I went to his office and said, "Hi, I'm from MIT. Could I have a copy of the printer software source code?" And he said, "No, I promised not to give you a copy." I was not only angry, I was shocked. I couldn't think of a way to express my anger that would do justice to it, not all of a sudden. All I could think of was to walk out of his office without saying even one more word to him. But I kept thinking about it afterward. You see, his refusal to cooperate with his colleagues at MIT, his shocking refusal, was bad for us because we never got that source code and we were never able to fix the problem, and that printer was frustrating to use for all the years we kept using it. But indirectly, it was very good for me because it taught me an important lesson, which is especially important because most computer users don't learn it. You see, he had promised to refuse to help his colleagues at MIT, but he didn't just do that to us. Chances are he did it to you as well. And I'd say he probably did it to you too. He might have done it to some of the rest of you, except I think most of you escaped because you weren't born yet. That was around 1980. But if you were already in existence, you were among the victims of his promise to refuse to cooperate with other people, because he did this to just about the entire population of planet Earth. He had signed a non-disclosure agreement. This was my first encounter with a non-disclosure agreement. I was the victim. I and my whole lab were the victims. And the lesson this taught me was that non-disclosure agreements have victims. They are not harmless, they are not innocent, they are doing wrong to other people. Most computer users first encounter a non-disclosure agreement when they're invited to sign one. You've probably been invited to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And most of the time, there's some kind of temptation or goodie that they're going to get if they sign. So they make up excuses to ignore the ethical issue of what they are doing. They say, they'll never get copies anyway, so why shouldn't I join the conspiracy to deprive them? They say, this is the way it's always done. Who am I to go against it? Or they say, if I don't sign this, somebody else will. Various excuses to gag their consciences. But when someone invited me to sign a non-disclosure agreement, my conscience was already sensitized. I was already aware of what it felt like to be the victim. And I could not, my conscience would not let me turn around and do the same wrong to you. That was a few years later, so probably most of you were born. I said, thank you for offering me this nice software package, but I cannot accept it on the conditions you have set, so I'll do without it, no thanks. And thus I have never knowingly signed a non-disclosure agreement for generally useful technical information such as software. There are other kinds of information that raise different ethical issues. For instance, there is personal information. I think it's legitimate to keep people's personal information private for them, and I can make a promise to do that. But when it comes to generally useful technical information, the stuff of science and technology, the mission of these fields is to develop knowledge for people to use. If we withhold this knowledge instead, we are betraying the mission of our field. After some years of thought, I reached the conclusion that this was wrong, that nobody should do this, and in particular, I should not do this. But during the same period of time, a series of blows fell on my community and destroyed it. I think the final blow was when digital discontinued making the PDP-10 computer. You see, the incompatible time-sharing system was written in assembler language for the PDP-10. So when the PDP-10 became obsolete and was discontinued, 15 years of our work turned into dust and blew away. Now you can imagine that's a hard blow in itself, but its consequences were much worse. You see, at that time, all the operating systems for modern computers were proprietary, and you had to sign a non-disclosure agreement just to get the binaries that you could run, which didn't mean you would get the source code. So this meant I faced a moral dilemma. I could no longer keep on doing my work of operating system development in the same way that I had been doing it, because that depended on having a community of people to cooperate with and a body of free software to use and improve in cooperation with those people. Both of them were gone. The community had blown away and had disintegrated, and the software was obsolete. So what was I going to do? The most obvious option was to accept that the world had changed and adapt myself to it. In other words, to be Shaw's reasonable man, which would have meant using non-free software and signing non-disclosure agreements. And I'm sure MIT would have had me developing non-free software too. I realized that this way I could have fun, and I could have fun programming, and I could make money. But at the end, I would look back at my career and say, I have spent my life building walls to divide and imprison people, and I would be ashamed of everything I had done. So I looked for some other option, and it was easy to think of one. I could leave the computer field and do something else. Programmers often find this peculiarly unthinkable. They can't imagine that they might leave the software field. Well, in the US today, a lot of them don't have any choice. But they used to think that they did have a choice. And they would say, if I don't do this, this, and this to get a programming job, I'll starve. That's literally what they said. Well, even in the US, and I think also in Turkey, there are millions of people who don't work with computers, and they're not all starving. A few of them are in the US, but that's a different problem. I had no other special noteworthy skills, but I could have become a waiter. Perhaps not at a fine restaurant, but I could have been a waiter somewhere. Now, there are two things to note about being a waiter. One is, as a waiter, you're not doing anything unethical, except perhaps if you work at McDonald's. And second, as a waiter, you're not going to starve. except perhaps if you work at McDonald's. People don't know this, but the popularity of McDonald's is due to an error, a confusion made by poorly educated Americans. They heard the term fast food and they thought it meant rapid food. They didn't realize it meant food for not eating. The purpose of fast food is to help you fast. So if you are fasting, but you're feeling hungry and you're feeling tempted to eat, you can think of that McDonald's product and lose your appetite. And that way you can complete your fast. I suppose that must be more useful advice here than in Cambridge. So maybe they need to have more McDonald's here. Anyway, now if somebody ever suggests to you that you should actually eat at McDonald's, you now understand how to explain why that's a mistake. But anyway, I had found a way I could ethically survive in my situation. And that's an important thing, because sometimes you can justify doing something unethical if the only alternative is that something even worse happens to you. You know, if you were literally going to die otherwise, you could justify developing a non-free program. But I've never heard of anyone who was really in that situation. So I had found an ethical way to survive, but I didn't like it very much. Being a waiter for me would be no fun at all, and it would be a waste of my skills as an operating system developer. Now, it's better to waste your skill than to misuse it. Developing non-free software would be misuse of my skills, making the world a worse place. It's much better to do nothing. Better, but not good. So for those two reasons, I decided to look for some better option. I asked myself, what could an operating system developer do that would be positive, that would make the world a better place? And I realized that operating system development is exactly the job that was needed. The moral dilemma existed for me and for any computer user because all the operating systems for modern computers were proprietary. So if someone were to develop another operating system and say, you can use this in freedom, this is free software, that would give everybody a way out of the moral dilemma, a way to escape from the bad choices that they faced. And I realized that this was probably the most important thing I'd ever have a chance to try to do in my whole life. And I concluded I had been elected by circumstances to do this job. It's as if you saw someone drowning and you knew how to swim and it were not Bush, then you would have a moral duty to save that person. Well, I don't know how to swim, but I do know how to write software. And in this case, the work that had to be done was writing software. I was concerned about this problem, and I could see that hardly anyone else was paying any attention to it at all. I had the skills necessary to try to solve it, and I could see that probably no one would do it if I did not. So I decided I would develop a free software operating system or die trying, presumably of old age, because at the time the free software movement had no enemies. We just had a large collection of software that we would have to write to carry out this plan. This decision led to technical design decisions. What kind of system should it be? I had just seen one free operating system turn into dust and blow away because it was written in assembler language for a machine that became obsolete. I didn't want to write another system and have the same thing happen. So clearly I wanted to make the new system portable. But I just knew of one successful portable system, and that was Unix. So I decided to follow the design of Unix, figuring that way there'd be a good chance I would succeed in making a system that would run and be portable. Further, I realized that users do not like incompatible changes. Just a second. Wearing this is supposed to help with the swelling in my wrist, which is caused by my elbow problem. Anyway, and the reason I was checking the bottle of water is I wanted to see if it was made by Coca-Cola Company. Because there's a worldwide boycott of Coca-Cola Company. They were having thugs kill union organizers in Colombia. And they've been doing some nasty things in other countries as well. So I'm participating in the boycott. So I was talking about how users don't like incompatible changes. If I had put together all the best ideas I had seen in various systems with my own pet ideas, I could have made my dream operating system. But when I showed it to users, they would have said, this is incompatible. We've already trained our users to use Unix, and we've written our software to run on Unix, and it would be too much work to switch to your system, so no thanks. At that point, I would have had a ready-made excuse. I could have told myself, I offered them freedom and they didn't take it, so it's their fault. But I wanted to make more than just an excuse for failure. I wanted to build a community that would have people living in it, living in freedom. So I had to develop a system that people would use. Being compatible with an existing system was a good way to help people switch. So I decided to make this system upward compatible with Unix. Upward compatible meaning we could add more features, but the features of Unix should continue to work in our system. This decision had an interesting consequence. Unix consists of many components that work together using interfaces that were more or less documented. So deciding to be compatible with Unix means deciding to use the same interfaces, which means that all the initial design decisions were made. The remaining design decisions were internal to one component, and they could wait until somebody wanted to write that component. So the only other thing I needed was a name. We hackers enjoy the spirit of playful cleverness. So whatever we're doing, whether it's programming or something else, we enjoy finding ways to be playfully clever. And that includes giving names to programs. We like to pick clever or even mischievous names. And there was a hacker tradition that when you were writing a program that's similar to an existing program, and this was something that often had to be done back in the days before programming languages were portable. You'd see some nice program on some other computer system. The only way you could have it, such a thing, was to write another one. We had a tradition that in a case like that, you could give your program a name that is a recursive acronym, which says that your program is not the other one. For instance, in the 60s and 70s, there were many similar text editors called Tico, something or other Tico. But one clever hacker called his program Tint, for Tint is not Tico. The first recursive acronym. We thought this was so much fun that we quickly looked for other opportunities. In 1975, I developed the first Emacs extensible text editor, the editor that you could reprogram while you were using it. And there were many imitations of Emacs. Some of them were called this or that Emacs, but one was called Fine for Fine is not Emacs, and there was Sign for Sign is not Emacs, and Aina for Aina is not Emacs, and Mince for Mince is not complete Emacs. Aina was mostly rewritten, and version 2 was called Zwei, for Zwei was Aina initially. So you could have lots of fun with recursive acronyms. And I looked for a recursive acronym for something is not Unix. But I quickly discovered that none of those combinations was a word, at least not in English. And if it doesn't have a second meaning, it's not funny. So I had to do it another way. I thought, what if I make a contraction? Then I could get a 3-letter recursive acronym. So I started trying letters. Anu, Bnu, Knu, Dnu, Inu, Fnu, GNU. Well, GNU is the funniest word in the English language. So that had to be the name. The reason the word GNU is used for so much wordplay is that, according to the dictionary, it's pronounced new. However, when it's the name of this operating system, please ignore the dictionary and pronounce it GNU. If you talk about the new operating system, you will get people very confused. You see, we've been working on it for over 20 years now, so it's not new anymore. But it still is and always will be GNU, no matter how many people call it Linux by mistake. So, having chosen a name, I could start the project. In September 1983, I posted an announcement on the net asking for people to join in and help. And in January 1984, I quit my job at MIT to start writing pieces of the GNU system. I had to quit my job because if I had remained an MIT employee, MIT could have turned my work into proprietary software products. I didn't want to take the risk that that would happen, and I didn't want to have to get the MIT administration's approval for every detail of the license that I wanted to write, for every detail of how this would be distributed. So I quit my job, and that took them out of the equation. But the head of the lab was nice enough to let me keep using the facilities. So I started using a Unix machine at MIT to begin writing pieces of the GNU system. At the time, I thought that we would develop an entire system and then tell people, come and get it. But that's not what happened. For the first half of the year or so, I was writing programs that were not particularly of interest to users at the time, although they were necessary to have in a complete GNU system. But in September '84, I started writing GNU Emacs, which was my second implementation of the extensible text editor. And by early '85, it was working well enough I could use it for all my editing. And other people wanted to edit with it too, because this was not comparable to some component of Unix. This was something I thought that a good system had to have. It was something that these Unix users did not have, and that's why they wanted to use it right away on top of their Unix systems. There wasn't a GNU system yet. There were just a few pieces, but they could run these pieces on a Unix system if they wanted to. People began asking me for copies of GNU Emacs, and I had to decide what I would tell them, how I would respond. Of course, I put a copy in the FTP server directory, and that was good for people who were on the net. But most programmers in 1985 were not on the net. What was I going to say when they asked me to send them magnetic tapes? I could have said, I want to spend my time writing more pieces of the GNU system, not writing tapes. So please find a friend who can download it for you and put it on a tape. However, I had no job, and I was looking for some way to make money through my work on free software. So I announced, send me $150 and I'll mail you a tape of GNU Emacs. And the orders began dribbling in. By the middle of the year, they were trickling in. I was getting 8 to 10 orders a month. And if necessary, I could have lived on that. Because I still live like a student. I've always thought of expensive habits as something, as traps to be avoided. They're dangerous because if you pick them up, then you develop a desperate need for money, and that starts to rule your life. Most Americans, if they start making this much money, they try to spend that much money. And they start buying houses and cars and boats and planes and rare stamps and artwork and adventure travel and children, all sorts of luxuries that place a tremendous burden on the world. And the result is they have to spend all of their time desperately trying to make money to pay for this, and they have no time left to enjoy any of it. What a shame. What a waste. But if you resist these expensive habits, if you live cheaply, then you too will be able to decide what to do with your life instead of letting the people with the money decide for you. Don't make the mistakes so many other people make. Don't tell yourself that if you buy all these expensive things, then you won't have to spend all your time desperately trying to get money. So many people don't look at what happens to other people, and they don't learn from what happens to other people, so they have to learn the hard way, and then it's too late. But people used to say to me, what do you mean it's free software if it costs $150? The problem is that the English word free is ambiguous. One meaning refers to price, and another meaning refers to freedom. When we speak of free software, we're referring to freedom, not price. So think of free speech, not free beer. It's clearer in Turkish. So please resist the temptation to use the English word when you're speaking Turkish. If you use the Turkish word Özgür, you will have no trouble with this confusion. Unfortunately, in English, there is no such word. There is no everyday word that means Özgür and does not mean gratis. So there's no way to avoid this confusion, really. Some of the users of GNU Emacs had got their copies from me through the net, and they did not pay me. Others got their copies from me on a tape, and they did pay me. Others got their copies from somebody else instead of from me. Maybe they paid that somebody else, but they did not pay me. it was entirely between those two people if one had to pay the other. So I wouldn't have known. So GNU Emacs was gratis for some users, and it was paid for other users. But it was free software for all of them, because all of them had the essential freedoms that make it possible to cooperate with other people as part of a community and to control your own computer. So let me now give the definition of free software. That is, make precise which freedoms I'm talking about. A program is free software for you, a particular user, if you have the following 4 freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you see fit. Freedom 1 is the freedom to help yourself by studying the source code to see what the program really does and then changing it to do what you want. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help your neighbor by distributing copies to others. And freedom 3 is the freedom to help build your community, the freedom to publish a modified version so others can benefit from your contribution. If you have all of these freedoms, the program is free software for you. But why are these the freedoms to use in the definition of free software? Why are these the important freedoms? Freedom 0 is I should go in another order. Freedom 2 is necessary on ethical grounds. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help your neighbor. And the spirit of goodwill, the spirit of helping your neighbor, is the most important resource of any society. It's not a physical resource, it's a psychosocial resource, but it's no less essential for all that. It's no coincidence that the world's major religions have been encouraging people to help their neighbors for thousands of years, because the level of this attitude in society can be influenced a certain amount, and even a little more makes society better to live in. So it's very important to encourage other people to pick up more of this attitude or spirit of helping their neighbor. However, if you are using a program that doesn't give you freedom 2, you have been prohibited from helping your neighbor. And you are facing a moral dilemma, a potential moral dilemma that becomes real anytime somebody comes over and says, "Could I have a copy of that?" Because what are you going to say? You have to choose between 2 evils. One evil is to make a copy for that person and violate the license. And the other evil is to comply with the license and refuse to help that person. So you're forced to do one evil or the other. I believe the lesser evil is to make a copy for that person and violate the license. The reason is that person presumably has not done anything to deserve your refusal to cooperate. Whereas whoever has tried to impose between you and other people a license that prohibits you from copying and sharing is doing something evil, is trying to break the bonds of society. And that person is the one, if some wrong must be done, it should be done to that person, because he's done something to deserve it. However, once you realize that using this program, which doesn't give you freedom 2, which comes with a license saying you're not allowed to copy and redistribute it, once you realize that using this means you potentially face a moral dilemma, the right thing to do is don't use it at all. The right thing to do is avoid going down the path that leads to the moral dilemma by not accepting the program in the first place. So my ethical commitment is, if I can't share the program with you, I won't take it. I'll say no. I will refuse to sign that non-disclosure agreement. Nowadays, the developers of non-free software and other non-free information are very powerful, and they have been gaining they have been getting the government on their side, and that's a very dangerous thing. The spirit of helping your neighbor is the most important resource of any society. So what does it mean when powerful social institutions tell you that you're not supposed to copy? They are poisoning that essential resource. And what does it mean when they say that if you copy, you're a pirate? If you share with your neighbor, you're a pirate. They're saying that helping your neighbor is the moral equivalent of attacking a ship. And that's completely backwards morality, because attacking a ship is very bad, and helping your neighbor is good. And what does it mean when they start imposing harsh punishments on people who share? How much fear is it going to take before people are too afraid to share with each other? Do you want such a terror campaign to be organized in your society? The word terror campaign is well deserved. In 2 countries already, the developers of non-free software have threatened the public with being raped in prison if they use unauthorized copies of software. And threatening people with rape can only be described as a terror campaign. I think we should put an end to this terrorism. So that's the explanation for why freedom, too, is an essential freedom. The freedom to help your neighbor, but that is the freedom to distribute copies to others. The other freedoms are necessary so that you can have control over your own computer. Freedom 0 is obviously necessary. If you are restricted even in how and when and for what purpose you can run the program, then you don't control what you do on your computer. But freedom 0 is not enough, because if you don't have the source code, then you don't control what the program does. The developer controls it instead. In order for you to have control over your computer, you've got to be able to make the software do what you want. In many cases, non-free software has malicious features that are designed to hurt you, restrict you, or gain power over you. For instance, many non-free programs spy on the user. One prominent example is Windows. If you use the feature in Windows to search your files for a string, this sends a report to Microsoft saying, we think it says what string you're searching for. And also, Windows XP, when it asks for an upgrade, reports to Microsoft the list of the software on your disk. Microsoft introduced a feature several years ago in a previous version of Windows to make it report what was on your disk. And there was outrage about this, so Microsoft took it out and put it back in secretly. It now sends this information encrypted, which made it hard for people to tell that this was happening. It required some clever investigation. But Windows is not the only system that spies on you. Windows Media Player is also spyware. Whenever you look at anything with Windows Media Player, it reports to Microsoft what you're looking at. But lest you think that Microsoft is the only non-free software developer that does this malicious thing, I should point out that Real Player also spies on you, and the TiVo also spies on you. The TiVo is a box that can record many television programs at once and let you watch them later. And whatever you watch, it reports. So some people were excited about the TiVo because it's based on GNU and Linux, but it also contains non-free software. And as this shows, just having some of the software be free does not mean that you're safe. But spying is not the worst of it. Many non-free programs reconfigure your computer. For instance, they set it up to display ads at certain times. This can be rather annoying, but they figure that there's nothing you can do about it, or at least that you won't know how. And they don't tell you before you get the program that it's going to install ads. But it gets worse than that. Some non-free programs, including Reader, have features designed to restrict you from accessing certain documents. In other words, they're designed to refuse to do their job, not designed to do it. And it gets even worse. It goes as far as actual backdoors. Windows XP, for instance, has a backdoor. It asks automatically for an upgrade. And when Microsoft sends you the upgrade, it knows who you are. So they could give you a special upgrade just for you. It's also possible that Windows has a backdoor already. Actually, it's not Windows, it's some other piece of Microsoft software that's widely used. I don't remember which. It has symbols NSA key and NSA key 1. Now, what do these symbols imply? Perhaps they indicate that some programmer was putting in a backdoor for the National Security Agency. Or perhaps they're nothing but somebody's whimsy. And they don't mean anything. We can't tell. And that's the whole point. We can't tell what that software is doing. Nobody can tell because we don't have the source code. Microsoft could have put in a backdoor. Microsoft might not have put in a backdoor. But you can't check. All you can do is put blind faith in the developer because the software is non-free. And there could even be a backdoor that Microsoft doesn't know about. I'm told that some Microsoft employees working on Windows XP were arrested and accused of working for Al-Qaeda and accused of putting in a backdoor for their own purposes. Now, if they had got away with that, or if somebody else has got away with that, Microsoft would not be directly responsible, but they would be indirectly responsible because they made the software non-free and thus prevented other people from finding this backdoor. Now, I don't want to say that all developers of non-free software put in malicious features. Some of them don't. Some of them try to do their best to make the software do what the user wants. But they're all human and they all make mistakes. These mistakes are called bugs. And when the developer of a non-free program puts in a bug, you're helpless. You can't find it, you can't fix it. We free software developers are also human and we also make mistakes. Our programs have bugs too. But because you have Freedom 1, you can find the bugs and you can fix them. We don't keep you helpless. We don't try to have power over you. And as a result, you're not forced to place blind faith in our work. You can check it yourself. Now, you and I are too busy to check all the software we use personally, but various people in the community are checking it. And people are less likely to think they will get away with some kind of nastiness if they know that someone else could catch them. With free software, they could be caught. With non-free software, it's very hard to ever catch them. So it's a temptation that some of them can't resist. Freedom 1 also lets you adapt the software to serve your needs. I may have done the best I can think of to do a certain job. Maybe your job is different. Maybe you don't want to do the same job I want to do. Maybe the features that were good for me are not good for you. With free software, with Freedom 1, you can change those features. You can make them be what you want. But Freedom 1 is not enough for two reasons. First of all, there are millions of computer users who don't know how to program, and they can't take advantage of Freedom 1 directly. They can't personally study the source code and change it to do what they want. But even for us programmers, Freedom 1 is not enough. Because there's so much software, none of us has time to study it all and master it all and make personally all the changes we want. In order to fully have control of our own computers, we have to do it together, working together. We have to be able to take control of our software collectively as well as individually. And that's what Freedom 3 is for. Freedom 3 is the freedom to publish a modified version so that others can benefit from your changes. Freedom 3 is what makes it possible for a group of users, for any collectivity of users, whether it's an explicit group of people who know about each other or an implicit group of people who have nothing in common except that they like the same change. Either way, they can work together to get what they want in the software. Suppose there are 1 million people who would like a certain program to be changed. Just by luck, you'd expect that between 1 and 10,000 of them know how to program. So eventually, a few of them could make that change. And then with Freedom 3, they can publish the modified version. And then all of those 1 million people can use the changed version, so they all get the change they want. Now, this is not guaranteed. The people who didn't make the change were waiting for someone else to make it. And you can't be sure someone else is going to make any particular change. If you want to be sure, you have to do it yourself or else convince somebody specific to do it. One way to convince somebody is to offer money. Suppose there are 1,000 users who want a certain change, and none of them is a programmer. They could put together money. Each one could put together, say, $20, and then they'd have $20,000. And with that money, they could, depending on the size of the change, maybe they could hire somebody to make the change they want and publish the modified version. At that point, they can all use it. So this shows us that one of the advantages of free software is that there is a free market for support. Support for a non-free program is generally a monopoly because only the developer has the source code, so only the developer can change it, which means that unless you are very big, the developer probably doesn't care about you and doesn't have time. There are companies that make you pay for permission to report a bug. And if you do that, they'll say, thank you so much. In 6 months there will be an upgrade. Buy the upgrade, and you'll see if we fixed this bug, and you'll see what new bugs we have in store for you. But free software support is a free market because anyone is free to study the program and then learn how to make changes in it for people. So various different people can offer you support. You can ask one company, how long will it take you to make these changes I want, and what will you charge? And then you can ask another company the same question and get and then compare the answers and decide who to do business with. When we often don't recognize how proprietary software automatically means a monopoly. Sometimes there's a choice of proprietary programs to do a certain job. You might think this means that there's no monopoly, but you'd be wrong. Because once you choose one of those programs, whichever one you choose, support for it afterward is going to be a monopoly. So you're in the peculiar position of choosing which monopoly you're going to be reader. This free market for support. Those organizations So those are the 4 essential freedoms and the reasons for them. A program is free software for you, a particular user, if you have all 4 of these freedoms. Please don't think of them as levels of freedom. They're not levels because all of these freedoms are essential. If any of them is missing, the program is not free software. So don't try to put them in an order of importance. Instead, you should insist on them all. Sometimes a program can start out free when it's released by its developer and become non-free among the users. How does this happen? Well, let me illustrate with an example. The example of the X window system. This was developed by a group at MIT and released under a license that gives you all these 4 freedoms. So if you got the MIT version, it was free software for you. But among those who got that version were various computer manufacturers that distributed Unix systems. They took the source code of X, they modified it to run on their platform, and they compiled it to get binaries. They put those binaries into their Unix system and distributed only the binaries under the same non-disclosure agreement as the rest of Unix. Millions of users got those non-free binaries of the X window system. And for them, it was completely non-free. It was no more free than anything else. This meant that there was a paradox. If you ask the question, is the X window system free software, the result depended on where you made the measurement. If you made the measurement coming out of the developers group, you'd say, I observe all 4 freedoms, it is free software. If you made the measurement among the users, you'd say, most of them don't have these freedoms, it's not free software. The developers of X did not consider this a problem. They were not aiming to give the users freedom. They were aiming for a big success. And they got a big success. As far as they were concerned, those millions of people using non-free versions of X were all part of their success. But in the GNU project, we were aiming to give users freedom. And if the same thing that happened to X had happened to us, GNU would be a failure. So I looked for some way to stop that from happening, and the method I developed is called copyleft. You can think of copyleft as being copyright flipped over. Legally speaking, we use copyright law, but instead of using it to subjugate other people, which is its normal use, we use it to protect the freedom of other people. Here's how it works. First, we say we put on a copyright notice, which reminds people that the program is copyrighted. And by default, that means it's forbidden to modify it or distribute copies. But then we say, you are authorized to make copies. You are authorized to distribute copies. You're authorized to modify this. You're authorized to distribute modified or extended versions. But there is one condition, and the condition is the reason we go to all this trouble. The condition says, whenever you distribute a program that contains any substantial part of this, then that whole program you distribute must, as a whole, be under this license, no more and no less. So your version must give its users the same freedoms that our version gives to its users. The condition also requires that you distribute the source code, that you make the source code available to the people who get the binaries. So you can't keep them helpless by denying them freedom one. The result is that the freedom and the software become inseparable. Wherever the software goes, the freedom goes with it. All the users who get the code get the freedom as well. And thus we establish these freedoms as inalienable rights for all the users of our code. Freedoms that cannot be taken away from you unless you do something wrong. So there is copylefted free software, and there is non-copylefted free software. About 2/3 of free software packages use the GNU General Public License, which is the principal copyleft license. But that still leaves plenty of other packages with different licenses. In both cases, the developers have respected your freedom. The developers have not tried to take away your freedom. So the developers have not done anything wrong. In the case of copyleft, the developers go even further and actively defend your freedom from anybody else who might try to take it away. So the people who develop free software but do not copyleft it, what they are doing is right, but they could have done more. We think they ought to do more. But we won't criticize what they have done. What they have done is free software. It does respect your freedom, and we can use it. During the 1980s, our work was to finish up, to complete the GNU system. So many different parts that had to be written and put together. In some cases, somebody else wrote a part that we could use, because it did the job and it was free. The X window system was one example. In the late 80s, I saw the X window system. I had always wanted to have some kind of window system in GNU, but we hadn't written one. And then I saw that X was powerful, it was becoming the de facto standard, and it was free software. At least the developer's version of it was free software. So I decided that we would not develop our own Windows system for GNU. We would use X. So we incorporated X into the GNU system and made the other pieces of GNU work with X. And that happened on some other occasions, but it was always a matter of good fortune. Because at the time, not many people had listened to the free software movement. When people made their programs free software, most often it was just coincidence for some other reason. There was one major exception, though. Around 1985, I visited the developers of BSD, the Berkeley System Distribution, I think it stood for, which was a modified version of Unix, and like every other version of Unix, it was not free software. So I said to them, AT&T is not a charity, so why are you donating your work to AT&T? At the time, anyone who wanted to get a copy of BSD had to present an AT&T source license. So even though legally and officially Berkeley's changes did not belong to AT&T, for all practical purposes, they might as well have belonged to AT&T. Practically speaking, the Berkeley developers were donating their work to AT&T. So I asked them to separate their work, and so that they could release it separately as free software. And they subsequently did so. The reason I asked them, of course, was that I hoped to use some of that work in the GNU system. There was no need for us to write every piece of the GNU system ourselves. The point was to bring this complete free operating system into being with the help of whoever we could get help from. But since only occasionally did somebody write another free program that we could use, all the rest we had to develop or recruit someone to develop. In October 1985, we launched the Free Software Foundation, which is a tax-exempt charity to promote free software. The FSF raises money and uses it in ways that promote free software. In the 80s and 90s, a lot of what we did was paying programmers. Some important pieces of the GNU system were developed by staff of the Free Software Foundation. For instance, the C library, which is used by every user space program to talk to the kernel. And for instance, the command interpreter, or shell, which some people type at and which shell scripts use. These were both developed by FSF staff. But the biggest part of the work was done by volunteers, people who offered to spend their time contributing to GNU. By now, there must be at least tens of thousands of GNU contributors. And the number of free software developers is around 1 million, although it could easily be twice as big or twice as small or half as big, because nobody really knows. By the early 90s, the system was almost complete. Only the kernel was missing. Now, when you have to develop several components and all of them are necessary, a priori, it doesn't matter what order you do them in. So I did them in the order that seemed easiest. And I was looking for someone from whom to get part of the kernel in order to save part of the effort. I figured if we got part of the kernel from somebody else, and in the meantime we wrote the other pieces we needed, then after we got part of the kernel from someone else, we would only have to write part of it. That is, whatever part we didn't get. So that would reduce the total work, and I expected it to mean we would complete the system sooner. Ultimately, we did get part of the kernel from someone else. In 1990, we decided to use the Mach microkernel developed by Carnegie Mellon University as the lower level of our kernel. So we would only have to do the other half to develop the higher level programs, which would actually run as user programs under Mach, or above Mach. And they would do the rest of the job that the Unix kernel does. I thought that this way we would get the job done sooner, but I was wrong. Perhaps because this had somewhat the nature of a research project, and perhaps because the people working on it were perfectionists and they approached it too much like a research project. In any case, it took many years for this kernel to run. Fortunately, we did not have to wait for it. In 1991, Linus Torvalds, a college student in Finland, began writing a kernel. He used the old-fashioned monolithic design, and he got it to run, barely, within less than a year. Initially, it was not free software. However, in 1992, he re-released it using the GNU General Public License. That made it free software because the GNU GPL is one of the free software licenses. At that point, it was possible to make a complete system by combining the GNU system and this kernel, which is Linux. This kernel was just the right thing to fit into the gap that still existed in the GNU system. We were not the ones who combined them. Linus Torvalds never contacted the GNU project to say, I've written a kernel, you might want to use it. Apparently, it never occurred to him to suggest it. But other people who knew about Linux figured they would look around to try to find other free utilities to put together with it. So they looked around, and lo and behold, everything they needed was already there. What good fortune, they said. But this was no accident. They had found all the pieces that were going to make up the GNU system as soon as the one missing piece was obtained. So when they thought they were taking these various different programs and putting them on top of the kernel Linux, really they were taking the whole GNU system and putting it on top of the kernel Linux. But they didn't realize that. And that failure to recognize the situation was the origin of today's confusion, whereby tens of millions of people are using this variant of the GNU system, and they don't realize they're using a variant of the GNU system. They think that the whole thing is Linux, and they think that the whole job was started by Linus Torvalds in 1991, which could not be further from the truth. The reason why this matters is that this confusion has broken the connection between the philosophy of GNU and the GNU system. It used to be, before we had a complete free operating system, that some people would install parts. They'd take some pieces of GNU and install them on top of some other operating system, a non-free operating system, therefore. And those people thought of themselves as GNU users. So when they read the articles we wrote about the philosophy of GNU, they would think, oh, this has something to do with this software I like so much. I should read it. I should pay attention to this. This didn't mean that they all had to agree with us. They would make up their own minds. But at least we had a chance of trying to convince them if they would read what we had to say, and if they recognized that it wasn't coming from just anybody, it was coming from the people who had written this software that they liked. So if they were convinced, then they would be likely to help develop free software, help extend GNU. So the software spread the philosophy, and the philosophy extended the software. But when people started using essentially the whole GNU system and calling it Linux, it no longer led them to our philosophy. Instead, it would lead them to the other philosophy associated with the name Linux, which is a very different philosophy because Linus Torvalds never shared our ideals of freedom. He made a contribution to free software for a different reason. He wanted to learn about kernels and have fun. Now, those are good reasons to do some useful work. But the result is, when people look at the whole system and think that it exists because of his values and his vision, they tend to reject ours by mistake. I've had people say to me, why should I pay any attention to this GNU philosophy? I'm a Linux user. What he means when he says he's a Linux user is he's using a variant of the GNU system. So it would seem like a good reason to at least pay attention to the GNU philosophy. But he doesn't know he's using the GNU system. He was taught to think that the whole system is Linux. And so he makes that ironic response. Some people say that the philosophy of free software is impractical. And they're using the operating system, which is our practical work. Now, if only they knew this, if only they knew that this system were GNU, they still could disagree, but they couldn't say it's impractical. And sometimes they say something even more ironic. This emphasis on freedom is foolish because it impedes the success of Linux. I've actually had people say that to me. And these people are not just confused about what Linux is, they're confused about what success is. They think success means mere popularity, mere number of users for a certain body of software. And they're confused about which body of software. Sometimes they think it's the kernel that Linus wrote, and sometimes they're thinking of the whole GNU system. But either way, they only want more people to use a certain body of software. So that they're making popularity the goal. Some of them are talking about the popularity of Linus's kernel. Well, it's a good kernel, it's mostly free software, but I don't see why we should make the popularity of that kernel be the ultimate goal. Why should any one kernel be that important that the number of people using it should be our goal? I think that they're missing the more important point, which is freedom. Some of them, when they say they want Linux to be a success, some of them are actually talking about the GNU system with Linux added. That is the GNU/Linux system. And they're saying that the popularity of this system should be the ultimate goal. Well, I do like it if the system becomes popular. After all, I started it. So it pleases me when this system becomes popular. But even I recognize that that's not what really matters. Because I and all the people who have helped, we developed this system to do something more important for the sake of freedom, to make it possible for you and us to live in freedom. And freedom is more important than the popularity of any particular software, including ours. So people who think that the success of the GNU system, which they are calling Linux, is the ultimate goal, are making a big mistake. The important thing is for us to bring freedom to a lot of people, ultimately to everybody. And that's how we should measure our success. If a person is using the GNU plus Linux system, but on top of that has installed some non-free applications, that person is not living in freedom. Yes, the system itself respects the user's freedom, but the application programs don't. So what we need to aim for is not just popularity of a particular collection of free software, not just that many people should be partly using free software. Our goal should be to show people why they should switch exclusively to free software, why they should reject non-free software that denies your freedom. And people will do this once they come to recognize what freedom means and to value it. History shows that people who don't defend their freedom will lose it. But in order to defend your freedom, you first have to value it. And in order to value it, you have to know what it is. Most of the people in our community have never heard these issues of freedom. They've heard about a system supposedly called Linux, and what they've heard about it is only practical advantages. That's what most of the people in our community talk about, is practical advantages. And they don't talk about freedom as the issue. So other people don't hear about freedom as the issue. About 3 years ago, someone came up to me after a speech and said that he had been working on developing free software for 5 years, and my speech was the first time he had heard anyone say that the whole point of this was freedom. Now that's pretty amazing. It shows you that the level of talking about freedom must be very low in order for people who are closely involved in the community to go for 5 years without hearing it. So we need to do more talking about freedom. And all around our community we can see that the name GNU is associated with freedom. The name Linux is usually not. The name Linux is usually associated with solely practical issues, solely practical values. And so the easiest way you can help us more effectively spread awareness of the issue of freedom is simply by calling the system GNU/Linux or GNU plus Linux. By using this term, you're not actually explaining the issue yourself. Of course, if you have the time and you want to explain the issue of freedom, by all means do so. But that takes a lot more time, so you can't always do it. But you can always say GNU/Linux. That takes very little time. And the result is that you will create an association in other people's minds between the system they're using and GNU, so that when they come across what we have to say about the GNU system and why we developed it, they will realize it has something to do with them, and they might pay attention. If it only works 1% of the time, it's still helping. It's such an easy thing to do. It's very efficient use of your time. So that's why I ask you to please call the system GNU/Linux and reserve Linux alone for the name of the kernel alone, to make a clear distinction between the kernel that Linus Torvalds wrote and the larger system that primarily comes out of our work, the system that is the combination of GNU and Linux, the GNU/Linux system. But some people reject this, and they say to me that some people are going to criticize me for what looks like asking for credit. They say that that looks bad, and so they recommend that when people call the system Linux, I should smile to myself and take pride in a job well done and say nothing about it. Well, this would be wise advice if the assumption were true, the assumption that the job is done. We are very far from completion of our job, of our mission. Yes, we've developed free operating systems, and they're used by tens of millions of people, but there are hundreds of millions that are using proprietary operating systems. So we have a long way to go before freedom triumphs. And yes, we have developed a wide range of free software packages, but there are many other application programs that users want which we don't have free software for yet. So we have a lot of work to go. We have a long ways to go. We mustn't start thinking that the job is done. We mustn't let everything drop here. We may be able to win this fight, but we're going to have to try hard. Because today, in addition to the job of writing a lot of software, which we've shown we're capable of doing, we now have the problem of powerful enemies that are explicitly trying to stop us from developing free software to do the jobs users want to do. In many countries, there are now laws prohibiting various kinds of free software development, prohibiting the development of free software for some of the jobs that users want to do on their computers. For instance, in the US, there is something called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. This law is misnamed because it's not mostly, well, it's only partly about copyright. Partly it's about restricting technology. And using this law, the free software to play a DVD has been censored in the US. The reason is that DVD videos are written in encrypted form, and the format was initially secret. This was used so that the movie companies could impose restrictions on all DVD players. The courts ruled that the free software to play a DVD was a circumvention device, that it was a way of getting around those restrictions. And so they ruled that this software is illegal in the US. But the US is not the only country to have such laws. The European Union adopted such a directive a few years ago, and the various countries of Europe are now passing laws to implement it. If they make the effort, I think that there's a way that they could implement that directive which still keeps free software legal. They could say that if a program only does the same jobs as the authorized programs, then it is not prohibited merely by virtue of being free software. But that's not what they're doing. What they're doing is being extremely harsh. I should warn you, by the way, that the European Union is not very democratic. That is what people have found out in the past few years. It's better not to join the European Union. The idea of a united Europe is exciting in theory, but in order for it to be a good thing, it has to be democratic. We in the free software community have been working for years to prevent Europe from allowing the patenting of software ideas. And we've actually won in the European Parliament. We convinced the Parliament to vote to amend the patent directive to exclude software patents. But the European Parliament's power is very, very limited. And we're afraid now that the Council of Ministers will undo what the Parliament has done. We haven't given up yet. We're now trying to persuade all the various governments of the EU member states to oppose software patents. We may still win, but this is showing us that the democracy of the European Union is rather weak. So these two different kinds of laws prohibit development of various kinds of free software. Patenting of software ideas could stop you in any area of software, in any area, no matter what job you're doing. There might be patents on some of the ideas you need to use in order to do it. It's not unusual for standards to be patented in the US. For instance, there is a patent covering GIF file format. In fact, there were 2 patents covering GIF file format, but one of them expired. The other one is still going on for a while. And as a result, free software has been unable to produce GIFs, and we have been urging people to switch to replace GIFs with ping. But having just one patent is just the mild form of the problem. Consider, for instance, the MPEG-2 video format, which is covered by many patents. I saw a list of 39 different US patents that supposedly cover this one standard. So one feature can be covered by many patents at once. If you look at a word processor today, you'll see that it has hundreds of features. Each of those features is at least one idea, at least one thing that might be patented by somebody else. So the result is that software patents make all software development dangerous. In a country that allows software ideas to be patented, developing a program is like crossing a minefield. With each step, chances are you're not going to step on a patent, but you might. And so when you have so many steps to make till you get to the completion of the program, the danger gets to be very large. The wise thing for a country to do is not to allow software ideas to be patented. In other words, not to allow these impediments to software development to exist in your country. The US is a hopeless case. In Europe, the European Union, we may still win, and what happens in Turkey is basically up to you. It's going to be up to you to convince the Turkish government that software patents are a stupid idea and it should not have them. This is joined by other problems that we face. For instance, it's not unusual for various I/O device cards or chips not to come with published specifications. It's hard to write free software to control that hardware if you can't find out how to run the hardware. And this has been a perennial problem over the years. We have solved it in some areas. You know, from time to time we've gained the cooperation of some manufacturer of hardware. We don't ask them to write the free drivers. We just ask them to tell us the specs, and we can write the free drivers. But new problems crop up. There are a lot of graphics chips whose specs are secret. There are a lot of wireless chips whose specs are secret. And we can't support them with free software. Instead, what happens is the manufacturers often release non-free drivers. And then they say, we, quote, support, unquote, quote, Linux, unquote. But if support means that, that you can use their hardware in the free world, the answer is no, you can't. Somehow or other, we're going to have to persuade these companies to tell us how to run that hardware, or else we're going to have to figure it out through reverse engineering. So that we can write the free software to enable us to use that hardware. In the meantime, we have to say no to that hardware. With tens of millions of us, we have significant market pressure if only we would use it. But our community is not organized to use it. And the reason is that most of the people in our community have never heard that this is an issue of freedom. They think that they are using a system called Linux solely because of its practical advantages. It would never occur to them to reject a non-free driver on principle because it doesn't respect your freedom. So we are failing to organize, failing to use our market power to push back on these companies. And finally, we now face an amazing threat, a conspiracy by many large companies to change the way computers are designed so as to change who controls them. They call this trusted computing. And just as you'd expect from companies like that, the name is deceptive. The name is spin. What they mean by trusted is that an applications developer can trust your computer to obey him instead of you. So from your point of view, it's not trusted computing, it's treacherous computing. And that's what we call it. Specifically, this is a conspiracy including companies such as IBM and Sun and Intel and AMD and Microsoft and Transmeta and many others. And I know this, I'm not just speculating, because it's not a secret. They say that they're all participating in this plot to impose a redesign of computers on the public, to take away your control of your own computer. Their idea is that data could be stored in special encrypted formats that can only be accessed by one application or by the applications authorized by one developer. Naturally, of course, they plan to use this for published data like music and videos and books, but they won't stop there. They plan to use this for your data as well. Microsoft is working very hard to make it impossible for us to develop free software that can read Word files. In the past, they did this just by keeping the format secret. So people figured out the format. It was hard work, but they figured it out. And today, free software can read most Word files. But Microsoft is trying various methods to stop this. One of these methods is patents. They have patented a bogus way of using XML, and they're using this as a way of trying to stop free software from reading the latest Word files. But that's not all. They're going to use treacherous computing as well. Imagine if 5 years from now, almost all computers have treacherous computing. Microsoft would change Word to use treacherous computing to encrypt all Word files. And then it would be impossible, not merely difficult or illegal, for us to write a free program that can read a Word file. That's what Microsoft intends to do. And they're trying this in every area they can think of. You may have noticed that for several months, Gates was talking about solving the spam problem by making the senders pay some small amount of money. I was suspicious. I said, if Gates is pushing this, there's got to be something poisonous in it. And I suspected that this is probably something that Microsoft has patented. Well, this week we found out that that's the case. They offered a patent license for the patents that Microsoft may have covering this technique. And this license is designed so that free software is impossible. You are not allowed under that license to release a program that others are free to redistribute. So we're going to have to reject that approach. Of course, the really nasty part of it is if we reject that, but suppose other people accept it, then we won't be able to send them mail. There's a much better approach. There's absolutely no need for anyone to consider pay email. The better approach is simply, when you get a message that looks like it might be spam, send a response saying, did you really mean this? If so, answer affirmatively in the following way. And if it's a human who got it, he or she will answer affirmatively, yes, I really meant this. And when your computer gets that response, it will automatically let the message come through to you. But if it's a spammer, it won't respond, and so you won't ever get that message. This is a much simpler solution, and there was no need at all for Gates's pet solution. The only reason for Microsoft to propose that solution is that it's a trap it is hoping people will fall into. Hoping that people will fall into it because Microsoft can talk so loud that many people might use it and never realize that there was a better thing to do. So this shows the kinds of opposition that we face today. It's no longer just a job of developing a lot of software. We now also have to fight political battles of the old-fashioned fighting for your freedom kind in order to retain the freedom to write the free software. Like it or not, we have to engage in political organizing. We have to push back against the organizations that are trying to make free software impossible. So I will now close by presenting, where is the other bag? Do you have it? Oh, good. You see, people have sometimes accused me of having a holier-than-thou attitude. Well, they're partly right. I hope that my attitude is not holier than thou, but it is holy, because I'm a saint. It's my job to be holy. So as soon as this other bag arrives, I will introduce my alter ego. Oh, boy, I should have thought of this at the beginning. Yes, but will the audience have left? I am Saint Ignatius of the Church of Emacs. I bless your computer, my child. Emacs started out as a text editor and then became a way of life for many users, and ultimately a religion. And now we even have a great schism between two rival versions of Emacs, and today we have saints, fortunately no gods. To be a member of the Church of Emacs, you must recite the Confession of the Faith. You must say, there is no system but GNU, and Linux is one of its kernels. The Church of Emacs has advantages compared with certain other churches, because to be a saint in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy. So those who are searching for a church to be holy in could consider ours. But it does require it requires living a life of moral purity. You must exorcise the evil proprietary operating systems that possess all the computers under your direct practical control, and then install a wholly free operating system, and then only install free software on top of that. If you vow to do this and carry out your vow, then you too will be a saint, and you too may have a halo if you can find one, because they don't make them anymore. Now, sometimes people ask me if it is a sin in the Church of Emacs to use the editor VI. So the answer is, using a free version of VI is not a sin, it's a penance. And sometimes people ask me whether my Halo is really an old computer disk. This is no computer disk, this is my Halo. But it was a computer disk in a previous existence. So, thank you, and now I will take questions.
İyi günler. Bilgisayar ve yazılımları kapitalizmin en son denetleme amaçlı ve kendi kendini yenileyen en gözde ürünü. Şimdi siz özgür yazılımın önerilmesiyle kapitalizm felsefesine, çünkü politik olarak karşı çıkmalısınız dediğiniz için soruyorum. Aynı zamanda kapitalizmi de karşınıza almış oluyor musunuz? Ya da sistemin ürettiği ürünün sürekli kapitalizmin propagandasını yapacağını düşünmüyor musunuz? Teşekkür ederim.
Well, free software exists within a capitalist society, and there has never been any contradiction between free software and the idea of a free market, because capitalism does not, contrary to what many governments and corporations believe today, capitalism does not mean that people lose their civil liberties. Capitalism does not imply that certain people should have power over other people. What we see today is the development of fascism. Mussolini, the inventor of fascism, said he could have called it corporatism because it was really a sort of combination of state power and corporations. If free software is against anything, it's against fascism. But there's no contradiction, no conflict necessarily between free software and capitalism. I have to say that I don't agree that software is the last tool of capitalism. We see capitalism applying for good or for ill in its current form in lots of areas of life, and software is just one area of life. I don't wish to get rid of capitalism. I do think that we should restore civil liberties and decrease the power that corporations have. But that doesn't mean abolishing capitalism. That means having a free society and a welfare state. The U.S. never, decades ago, didn't see any contradiction between civil liberties and a welfare state on the one hand and capitalism on the other. Today, in the name of capitalism, its corrupt government is trying to get rid of civil liberties and the welfare state. But that is a misuse of the idea of capitalism.
Why would people want to make software if they're not going to make money out of it?
Well, that's like saying, why would an airplane fly? It's a silly question based on denying the facts. Now, if you want to ask a meaningful question, you should ask, why do people write free software? I've seen many motives. One motive is political idealism, trying to make it possible for people to live in freedom. Another motive is to have fun. Programming is tremendous fun, and it's especially fun if nobody's telling you what to do. And this is why many people who work as programmers write free software in their spare time. Another motive is to be admired. If a lot of people use your free program, that's a lot of people admiring you. Another motive is professional reputation. If, say, 1% of the community uses your free program, that's hundreds of thousands of users. So that's enough to give you a good professional reputation right there. Another motive is gratitude. If you've been using the community's free software for years and really appreciating how good it is, then when you write a useful program, that gives you an opportunity to give something back. Another motive, a rather shallow motive, but it does motivate people, is hatred for Microsoft. I think it's a mistake to focus too much on Microsoft. Microsoft is doing something wrong. It's developing non-free software. But many others are doing the same thing that is wrong. And we shouldn't focus so much on one that we forget that the others are also wrong. And that's the pitfall. People who hate Microsoft, who focus their hatred on Microsoft, tend to overlook the fact that other software is also non-free. But when it's a fact that there are people who contribute to free software because they hate Microsoft. And even though I think that there are wiser reasons to do it, they are contributing. Another motive is because they want the software to work better. They may believe that when people are free to copy and change the software, that leads to higher quality software. They may be right. In any case, there are people who make programs free for that reason. And another motive is money, because some people are getting paid to write free software. Probably thousands of people, although I don't know.
So I fully appreciate the importance of the GNU project in the evolution of the so-called Linux operating system, because I was there. My question is, you criticize the people who believe that success shouldn't be a goal in terms of popularity and widespread use.
Oh, I said that success shouldn't be the main goal.
Oh, okay. At the same time, You talk about how the popularity of the operating system has given the movement very strong market power.
Yes, which we failed to use.
But
I'm not saying success is a bad thing. I'm not saying success is not desirable. What I'm saying is that we're making a mistake if we define our ultimate goal as the popularity of any particular body of free software.
My assertion is that talking about things like GNU/Linux impedes the ability to attain the widespread use because it confuses people.
It doesn't.
And therefore,
as I said, first of all, I don't believe this. This is a pure imagination on your part. But second, my point is, although popularity is desirable, all else being equal, it is not the main point. So I don't think that if your argument starts from popularity as the goal, then I disagree with the premise.
Popularity is the means, and if you take a look
it's
at...
not the only... No, it's not.
It
no.
is the means. If you take a look
No,
at...
it's not.
Could
It is part.
Could I finish?
Go ahead. You
Okay.
can have the floor.
No, I would just like to finish a sentence, which is, if you take a look at what we've accomplished, it goes far beyond software. It extends into the realm of politics and economics and even biotechnology. So it's really more about the process and the movement. And to me, the enabler of that and all of the good that comes of it is the fact that we have the market power.
Well, I disagree with every step in what you've just said. First of all, it's not true that popularity is the means. Popularity helps, but popularity alone doesn't do much. The popularity of our software won't do any good unless it is coupled with teaching the users to value freedom. Now, if we could easily potentially have market power, but we don't really have market power because we're failing to exercise it. Now, why would people exercise it? If people are demanding freedom, then they will say no to the chip that can't be used with a free driver. But because the way we gained popularity is by failing to talk about freedom, the people have never thought of the idea they might want to say no to a non-free driver. So although popularity is desirable, all else being equal, I certainly, I want everyone to have freedom. I don't want just a few people to have freedom. So popularity of something is part of the goal. But if you forget about the rest of the goal, then you're liable to make bad decisions.
I completely agree with your end. I just think that your means isn't quite right.
Well, you're entitled to your opinion. I've seen plenty of evidence that the failure to teach people that this is the GNU system leads to a failure to teach them about the ideas of freedom. These ideas of freedom are not generally associated with the name Linux. They are generally associated with the name GNU. Now, if you just say the GNU plus Linux system, you're not explaining the ideas in those few words. You can't explain these ideas in 5 words. But you're preparing people to take a look at things that people tell them about GNU, to pay more attention to it. When they hear that the GNU project believes in freedom, but Linus Torvalds is happy using non-free software, what conclusion will they draw? If they think of themselves as Linux users, they will think Linus is the one who gave us this system. Let's listen to his views most. If they know that it's the GNU plus Linux system, then they won't think that way. Then they might pay equal attention to our views. So in those few words where you talk about the system, you don't have room to explain ideas. but you can predispose people to pay more or less attention to these ideas or those ideas, and that has an influence which is quite big compared with the amount of time that you're spending on it.
Well, I have one question, or I have a couple of questions. But one, what if Linux hadn't happened?
Sorry, what Linux? What?
What if Linux kernel hadn't come out? You were working on some kernels, but what would have happened in that case, for example?
I could only speculate.
Yes, please.
I mean, if we had finished the herd sooner and there had been no Linux, then I guess we would have had more. We would have been heard more when we tell people that this is all for freedom.
But I wonder if, like you talked about the developer you met 3 years ago who had been working for 5 years on free software and he didn't know anything about freedom. Does that not suggest that your message just wasn't getting across?
It isn't getting across. The question is why. And a large part of why it's not getting across is that the people who use the GNU system don't know about GNU at all. They see so many articles talking about Linux, and if they ever want to find out more, they go to things talking about Linux. So many articles will mention Linux. So if they want to get more information, they look for things that explain Linux, and what they find is not our message. If they knew that the system were GNU, then they would look differently, and they would find our message.
Is Linux a good or a bad thing in your opinion?
Well, mostly it's a good thing because it enabled us to have a complete free operating system. So I don't think it was bad to write Linux. I think it was an unfortunate mistake when the people who combined Linux and GNU got confused and called the whole thing Linux, thus giving the principal developers none of the credit. I think that confusion was a bad thing. But the development of Linux itself was an important contribution to our community.
As you know, we have been living through some important forking process. The Red Hat became Fedora and other enterprise Linux, something like that. And in the presentation before you, there was an analogy, a good analogy, like Red Hat versus Microsoft. Red Hat with Microsoft, it was something like the Animal Farm, George Orwell's Animal Farm.
I think the whole idea is a mistake. Red Hat does good things and bad things. The Red Hat software distributions for many, many years have included non-free software. In fact, it has been many years since you could find a Red Hat product in the store that was all free software. Red Hat also does some good things. When Red Hat develops software, they always make it free.
Okay.
So Red Hat is contributing to our community by developing free software. But their distributions have been something that you must avoid for a long time.
I also did so, but I'd like to ask this. I haven't been using Red Hat for quite a while now, and they can do whatever they want, but I feel threatened that such a underlying GNU and Linux structure is just one step away from proprietary software.
There's nothing we can do to stop people from adding proprietary programs to the system.
Okay, but one
And when they do
distribution
that-
based on Linux, those non-proprietary, those free software becomes another thing now. And if one becomes so, the other may also.
I can't follow those words, what they mean. But I agree it's a problem. It's just that I don't know any simple solution to, I don't know anything we can do in a short period of time that will solve this problem permanently. We just have to learn to reject non-free software. And we have to teach other people to recognize the freedom that's at stake, and then they will see why they would reject non-free software. That is, I don't know of any other solution.
Mr. Stallman talking in front of IBM logo, a huge IBM logo. Do you think this is a contradiction?
Gee, I hadn't even noticed it. And yes, in fact, I said I didn't. I had told in my instructions. I'd said I didn't want them to be there. I just didn't look. So they should have taken it down. IBM is a complicated situation. IBM develops some free software, and that's useful. But IBM also develops a lot of non-free software, which is harmful. I don't think there's anything wrong with a support business, which is what IBM is starting to do. And when IBM advertises the idea of using the GNU/Linux system, I think that's useful, although it's a shame that they called it Linux. So IBM is doing some good things and some bad things, but I don't want people to think that I am in any way a supporter of IBM. Another bad thing that IBM is doing is is advocating software patents.
I heard you pronounce the word free in Turkish, Özgür, very well. Why do you keep on pronouncing Linux as Linux? Is it on purpose or is it some kind of
I don't
capacity?
understand.
Why do you pronounce Linux as Linux?
Because that's the common pronunciation of it in English.
Is it?
Yes. Because it's, you know, in some languages the U tends to be pronounced U, but in English it's more likely to be pronounced
What
So if you're speaking Turkish, you would probably call it Linux.
Yes,
right? That's
it's GNU is pronounced as GNU in Turkish, and if someone has
sorry, what's pronounced GNU in Turkish? I don't understand.
it's the same GNU. You
Yeah.
can pronounce it in Turkish as GNU. Did
Yeah.
anybody call GNU as GNU or Jna, something like that to you?
I wouldn't get mad. In Spanish, I've decided it's best to pronounce it "new"
Thank you.
because in Spanish that won't cause any confusion, and that's how the name of that animal is actually pronounced in Spanish.
Thank you.
And yesterday, Mr. Murdoch have received a question about the project Mono. I thought that it would be much better to forward that question to you. What do you think about the .NET implementation of Linux? Meaning Mono.
Sorry, what do I think about the what?
Mono, the .NET framework implementation on Unix.
Well, it's not the implementation. It's actually the Mono is an implementation of C#. At least that's what I recall. And it's not the only one. The GNU project also has one called Portable.net. And Mono is free software, so basically it's ethical.
Öncelikle teşekkür etmek istiyorum sizlere. Keşke daha fazla vaktimiz olsaydı ve daha fazla konuşabilseydik. Eminim öğrenebileceğimiz çok şey var sizlerden. Şunu sormak istiyorum. Çevremizdeki insanlarla biz konuşurken özgür yazılımı anlatmakta yaşadığımız en büyük problemlerden biri konuştuğumuz insanın bunu kendi anladığı ekonomik model üzerine oturtamaması. Bununla ilgili benim nacizane fikirlerim var ama ben sonuçta bir coder'ım ve ben sanırım kendi işimi yapmakla yükümlüyüm her şeyden önce. Sizin konuşmanızda bazı kısımlarını
I'm hearing the English translation, I just don't understand. It seems to be hinting at various things but not really saying them. And so I don't understand.
Okay, shall I try it in English? I have a problem with an economic model that will actually mean the free software as we're talking right now. In business life.
Please let me say, the free software movement does not advocate any particular economic model.
What I'm saying is that if we need one to be able to explain what we have in our minds to other people, should we go to people with our economic model?
I don't understand. I mean, I'm not sure what ideas you have in your mind. The ideas that I have in my mind are not based on an economic model, and I don't explain them using an economic model, as you have heard. So you may have different ideas, and you may be looking to explain them with an economic model, but how would I know? There must be some connection that's not being made explicitly. I don't get it.
Okay, let's move on to the next. Bisorek.
I want to ask that the next step is, I think, or it might be the free hardware. You said that trusted computing. After trusted computing,
treacherous
computing.
What's
spread?
Don't call it by their name.
After this computing, this new, bad technology, I think it might happen free hardware foundation.
Well, let me respond to this. First of all, it doesn't make sense for hardware to be free in the same sense that software is free.
I'm not expressing it's
but
same.
There will be issues about whether you can trust what the hardware is doing. I don't necessarily know the solution to those problems, because the solution we use for software won't work for hardware. The solution we use for software is essentially you get the plans and you build it yourself. And that won't work for chips. You can't build the chips yourself.
Yes.
A fab line costs millions of dollars. So I don't know the solution. But it may be that over the years, we will move to a situation where we must insist that hardware be free in some appropriate sense. But I don't know what that sense will be. We'll have to see what solutions work. Remember, I didn't invent free software. I saw this method being used, this form of society existing. I saw it worked for the purposes of living in freedom. And after I saw it worked, I said, I believe in this. I didn't just imagine it and say, I believe this will work, because I wouldn't be so confident. If I hadn't seen it in use, I would have had doubts.
Şimdi Türkçe söyleyeceğim. Daha iyi ifade edeceğimi zannediyorum. Annem mesela kek yapıyor. Keki çok bozulmuyor. Çok güzel oluyor. Ne yaptın diyorsun. Yani ne koydun anne diyorum. Yok şunu koydum. Sirke koydum diyor. Siz şeyden bahsettiniz ilk başta. Çok hoşuma gitti. Komşuna yardım et. Bu kullandığı yöntemi komşusuna da anlatıyor. Şunu kullandım, şöyle yaptım diyor. Bu çok güzel bir noktaya temas ettiniz. En önemli nokta bu. Mesela bizim ülkemiz dışarıdan domates tohumu alıyor İsrail'den. İsrailler biz bu domates yetiştirdiğimizde domates tohum vermiyor. Her sene bir daha satıyorlar bu tohumu. Mesela bu çok onların düşünce yapısının örneği çok bir örneği. Tabii ben burada ücretsiz donanım derken kimse oturup çip yapamaz tabii. 10 kişi bile yapamaz ama aynı şey bu kekin tarifinde geçtiği gibi bazı algoritmalar da patentli.
Please, may I respond, please?
Okay.
First of all, you're right that this is exact same issue for recipes. If you imagine telling cooks, if you share or change a recipe, we'll put you in prison. We'll call you a pirate. The anger that cooks would feel is exactly the anger I felt when people said that to me about software. So that's exactly the same issue. The issue about the tomato seeds is a very similar issue. It's true that, normally breeds of plants will reproduce, but, hybrid seeds won't. And then there's this terminator gene that's designed to stop things from reproducing. And when farmers' freedom to save their seeds and breed their crops is taken away, that's very much like non-free software. However, it's a mistake I think it's a misunderstanding when you speak of whether people could develop a chip. I'm not talking about developing a chip. A few people working together can maybe develop a chip the same way they could develop a program. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about making the chip. Maybe you and 4 other people could develop a chip design, but you couldn't make the chip from it. You need a very expensive piece of equipment to do that. And that's what makes the issue quite different. All of us have computers, I expect. We could all compile source code into executables and run it. We don't need to go to some $10 million piece of equipment to compile a program. That's what makes free software work. And what we do with chips is going to have to be somehow different because of the fact that we don't have chip-making machines. Even if we had designs for the chips, we couldn't make real chips from the designs. So that's a big difference in the situation. And the result is to follow the model of free software won't work with chips. What will work, I'm not sure. And I think we may need to have experience. We may need to try out various ways of trying to solve the problem of can you trust what this chip is really doing before we find a solution that works.
I want to say that, sorry, just a minute. When I say free hardware, I don't say that to sell it with no price. I say that it explains how it works. It might other manufacturers to help him. I'm saying that against the trusted competing. What I am saying is against the trusted competing, to taking freedom from us. And I know software development is different.
I think we understand you, and I pretty much agree with you. So, but this is very slow, so maybe we can move on.
Okay.
Okay.
A question on moral purity. One of your freedoms, you stressed how important it was to help one's neighbor and to help a community of neighbors.
Yes, you should be free to help your neighbor.
Okay, but
that's what I'm saying.
Okay, well, if the software was going to be used, for example, in some corrupt regime, maybe the state of Texas, according to your definition, but
well, I'm not saying that you should always give a copy to everyone who asks you for it. If a person who you think is a scoundrel asks you for any kind of help, you might say no. But the point here is not that. The point here is, have you promised you won't help anybody? That's what non-free software does. They make you promise you won't help anybody.
But should you legislate for? It's not really freedom if some people are excluded.
I don't understand. I don't know how your statement relates to anything I've said at this point. I haven't said that some people should be excluded. I've said you might decide that if you are free to help people, you will not necessarily grant every request that is made to you. I'm not saying you are obligated to always help everybody who asks you. I'm saying that you should be free to do so on your discretion.
I wanted to ask a question about actually a specific free software package. And this free software package is called VRMS. And how does that make you feel?
Well, originally I felt a bit flattered, a bit honored. Nowadays it's a bit ironic.
Okay, right over there.
Some of the companies are sells them products on the freedom software system. I mean, just like Kaynak.
I didn't hear the beginning, the first few words.
So I mean, somebody's are developing some systems or some softwares on the freedom system.
But they are not free. Their products are not free.
Yes, what do you think about that?
I think it's bad because it's not free software.
Okay.
I won't use those.
Okay, I'm a software developer and I have some conflicts about that. My company wants to sell my softwares, but we are making it on a Linux system. I don't want...
I think not. I think you're making it for the GNU plus Linux.
Okay. How can I do about that? How can I protect to my freedom?
Well, if you're asking me how can you convince your boss, I don't know. I'm not an expert on that, and I don't know anything about the situation in your company, so maybe there is no way to convince them. What I would probably do is, if I couldn't convince them, I'd quit. And, I quit my job at MIT merely because it was possible that they would make my software non-free. I didn't even take the chance. Before I wrote the software, I made sure that there was no threat. And that's what I recommend if you want to write some software and you work in a company or you are connected with a university, make sure that you get the agreement that your software will be free before you finish it. Well before you finish it. Like maybe when it's just half done. At that point, they still need you. At that point, if you say, I'm only interested in finishing this if it's going to be free software, they'll probably give in. Because they figure if they say no, then you won't finish it, and what have they got? Nothing. They'd rather have their name being glorified by your free program, which will mention that it was developed at such and such a place, than nothing. But if you finish it, and then you go and say, will you let me make this free software, then you have lost all the power, because they don't need you anymore. And you notice I'm implicitly referring to the thought patterns of gangsters. Once they don't need you anymore, they figure you're dispensable. And they don't care what you think. So you've got to make sure you get this decision made while they still need you. What time does this go on to?
But, I have a suggestion to make, which is the program is now for us to have a panel.
I'm a bit tired and I have a lot of work to do. So I've answered plenty of questions and I would like to go and do other work.
Okay, you want to wrap up now? Okay.
Yes.
Do you want to make a concluding remark or you just want to...
No. I hope that you will help the free software movement one way or another.